Hi class, in lesson 6.1 you will be introduced to percents. Learning targets for today, you will write fractions, decimals, and percents, model percents on a hundredths grid, and explain the similarities and differences of percents, fractions, and decimals. A key term to look for in lesson 6.1, percent. Turn to page 390, problem 1. They're all part of the same family. Let's look first at the statements. 80% chance of rain, 90% on a science test, 25% discount, 20% tip, 80% free throws, 7% sales tax, and 90% sunny days in Arizona. We can see that percents are all around us whenever we are looking at real-world situations. A percent is a fraction in which the denominator is 100. Percent is another name for hundredths. The percent symbol means out of 100. Therefore, 35% means 35 out of 100. 35% as a fraction is 35 over 100. 35% as a decimal is 35 hundredths. And if we look at 35% as a ratio, we could write 35 to 100. So if we think about that, we know that percent is a part to whole ratio. You can shade 35 out of the 100 squares on the hundredths grid to represent 35%. What we need to make sure that we understand in starting the lesson for today is that percents, fractions, and decimals can all be used interchangeably. Turn to page 392 and answer number 2, letters A through D with your group members. For number 2, letter A, I have 44 squares on the hundredths grid shaded in. My equivalent fraction is 44 over 100, and my decimal is 44 hundredths. For letter B, I have 16 squares shaded in. My equivalent fraction is 16 over 100, and my decimal is 16 hundredths. For letter C, I have 97 squares shaded in. My equivalent fraction is 97 over 100, and my decimal is 97 hundredths. And finally, for letter D, I have 117 squares shaded in. My equivalent fraction is 117 over 100, which is also equal to 1 and 17 hundredths as a mixed number. And my decimal is 1 and 17 hundredths. Turn to page 393 and answer number 3 with your group members, and remember that a percent is going to tell you how many hundredths. If you look at the patterns back in question 2, you should see that you can move the decimal point in a percent 2 places to the left in order to write the percent as a decimal. Please answer number 4, letters A through D, and number 5, letters A through D with your group members. For number 4, letter A, you should have 12 hundredths, B, 3 hundredths, C, 80 hundredths, and for letter D, 1 and 25 hundredths. For number 5, letter A, you should have 40%, B, 37%, C, 73.81%, and D, 52%. When the denominator is a factor of 100, scale up the fraction to write it as a percent. When the denominator is not a factor of 100, you can divide the numerator by the denominator to write the fraction as a decimal, which you can then write as a percent. Please answer number 6, letters A through D with your group members, and you may use your calculator. For number 6, letter A and letter B, the denominator is a factor of 100, so you could have scaled up to write it as a percent. A would be 80% and B would be 30%. For letter C and letter D, the denominators are not factors of 100, so you would have to divide the numerator by the denominator in order to get a decimal and then write it as a percent. So for letter C, you should have 37.5%, and for letter D, you should have 33.3%. Turn to page 394 and please answer number 7, letters A, B, and C with your group members. You may also use a calculator for this part if needed. For number 7, letter A, your missing fraction is 2/3. Your missing decimal is 33 hundredths, and your missing percents are 33 1/3% and 66 2/3%. You could also write it in decimal form as your percent if you did that as well. For letter B, your missing fractions are 1/8, 1/4, 3/8, 5/8, and 3/4. Your missing decimals are 25 hundredths, 375 thousandths, 5/10ths, and 875 thousandths. And your missing percents are 12 5/10%, 50%, 62.5%, 75%, and 87.5%. And for letter C, your missing fractions are 1/5, 3/10ths, 1/2, 3/5, 4/5, and 9/10ths. Your missing decimals are 1/10, 3/10ths, 4/10ths, 6/10ths, 7/10ths, and 8/10ths. And your missing percents are 10%, 20%, 40%, 50%, 70%, and 90%. Please turn to problem 2, number 2 on page 396. On Saturday, Melanie won 3 out of 4 of her tennis matches at the Redstone tournament. On Sunday, she won 1 out of 4 of her matches at the Mesa tennis tournament. So take a look at the 3 examples for Patrick, Laura, and Jonathan and the work that they did, and answer letters A through D with your group members on page 397. For letter A, Patrick assumed the denominators of each fraction represent the same whole, but they represent 2 different wholes from 2 different events. When you combine all of the matches together, there are a total of 8 tennis matches. For letter B, Laura made her reasoning explicit or very specific by labeling each of her ratios. For letter C, Laura and Jonathan both correctly determined the total number of matches won out of the total number of matches played. What is different is that Laura wrote her ratios in fraction form and Jonathan used colon form. And finally, for letter D, Melanie won 4 out of the 8 matches that she played. This will conclude today's lesson 6.1 on Introduction to Percents. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.